Right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss. A tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened. It happened. An uppercut by Douglas. Down goes Tyson.
Thompson, right hand shot.
Excellent. Knocks out by Tyson.
Slumps to the canvas.
The champion struggles to stay on his feet.
How do you like it? How do you like it?
Welcome, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast, Legendary Nights. And today's episode is voted for by you, the listeners, and the followers on Twitter on the poll. It's the tale of marvellous Marvin Hagler versus Sugar Ray Leonard from way back in 1987 for the WBC Middleweight Championship of the World. Before we get into the episode, however, please go and find us on social media at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook as well. Also, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, you can do by going on Apple Podcasts on your iPhone, subscribing to get all the latest episodes of Legendary Nights, plus all the other series that we're running. If you don't use Apple iPhone and you're using Android, there's plenty of apps out there that we're on: Podbean, Stitcher, Spreaker, Player FM, even Spotify, and even Eat Sleep Boxing Repeats YouTube channel as well. So this is it, as voted for by you. This is the tale of marvellous Marvin Hagler versus Sugar Ray Leonard for the WBC Middleweight Championship of the World from 1987.
I've been looking forward to this fight for years. This is not a career for me. This is one fight. This is a dream that has become a reality. I am the best fighter in the world. The reason I will win is because you don't think I can.
So it's April the 6th, 1987. It's the Superfight between marvellous Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard. Johnston, one of the greatest fights of all time, one of the greatest nights, and it's come up for Legendary Nights, and a fight I'm very much excited to talk about.
Same here, Sean. Really great fight, as you say, 1987 in the car park at Caesar's Palace to accommodate those thousands of attendants that wanted to watch this fight, because it was such a super fight. Very controversial, but also very entertaining against, with two of the best fighters, in the history of the sport. So really looking forward to cracking on with this one.
So, as always, we will be covering the Legendary Nights, Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler super fight in the same fashion as we always do. We're going to be talking about a little bit into their careers leading up to for this particular fight. We'll talk about the build up for the fight, and we'll also cover off the fight breakdown and the aftermath for both men. So let's start then. Let's go with Marvin Hagler's career first, because this is the second time Marvin's come up in the Legendary Nights series. The first one being Hagler Hearns. I think that might have been the very first episode, if memory serves me correctly. So it's good to see Marvin back in the Legendary Nights series, and obviously it's great to be talking about his career. Such an established career, such a great career that he had, and this particular fight that we're going to touch on today, and it's the last fight he ever had professionally, which is, I know, something we'll touch on in the aftermath, but it's crazy to think that this is the super fight between these two fighters, and this was the last fight of Marvin Hagler's career against Ray Leonard. So going back to the last couple of fights before this fight happened, we've covered one already, the Legendary Nights Hagler Hearns. The Hearns in 1985 was such a fantastic fight, one of the best fights that I have ever seen.
Unreal fight. Tommy Hearns fight. I mean, that first round in particular, I mean, the whole 3 rounds was amazing, but that first round in particular was just unbelievable. We're talking about, Hitman Hearns here. For me, he was one of the best aggressive fighters that's ever lived. The guy, his shot selection was unreal. So we're talking about Tommy Hearns. Fair enough, he fought him. I think it was a middleweight. I'm taking a punt here. I'm sure it was.
Yeah, it was.
Because obviously with Hagler being the middleweight. But for me, Hitman Hearns, he was probably one of the best light middleweight that's ever lived. At 154, he was phenomenal. He was absolutely outstanding fighter. But what a fight. Absolutely outstanding fight. And one that will long live in the memory. And even the commentator, Al famously said the line, it didn't go very far, but it was a beauty.
He's certainly right. And the next fight, before we got to the Ray Leonard fight, was another brutal war for Marvin Hagler. It was John Mcgaby, and another fight which, if you've not seen this fight with Hagler and Mcgaby, it's an absolute cracking fight. If you think Hagler-Hearns was amazing, this is just as good. This is just an underrated fight, from my opinion, because of how big Hagler-Hearns was and how much of a lasting legacy it's left. The Mcgaby fight, for a lot of the wider audience, completely gets forgotten about. But if you're a hardcore boxing fan like ourselves, we know about it. We know how good of a fight the Mcgaby fight was, and how much of a tough fight it was for Marvin Hagler as well. And it's one that kind of makes you feel a little bit like Hagler took some real tough nights in the lead up to the fight with Ray Leonard, and it's something I'll touch on a little bit later. But I feel like the two fights in particular, Hearns and Mcgaby, were the two fights, ironically, that he had before he fought Ray Leonard. But they were two very, very tough nights for him, I think. I think he was involved in some absolute wars, and these were the pinnacle of his career for me. Them two fights were the pinnacle of his career before he came into the super fight with Ray Leonard. So the Mcgaby fight, what a fight that was, Johnston. Watching back on that particular fight, would you say it's one of them fights that it is underrated?
Absolutely, yeah, it really is. I mean, John Mcgaby was, he was 25-0 with 25 knockouts. So, he come with a lot. Obviously, his opposition in those 25 fights were, they were slightly underrated in terms of what Hagler had faced. But, John Mcgaby was a fantastic fighter. He was actually, he was Ugandan, wasn't he? And he actually moved over to London to train with Mickey Duff. So, although he was Ugandan, he was almost one of our own, if you like. But unfortunately, he was named Mcgaby as well, which always makes me laugh after the bastard president Mcgaby. But yeah, no, it was an excellent. It was a great scrap. I mean, Hagler beforehand there was a war of words, and sort of Hagler said Mcgaby was known as the Beast, and he said he's going to feast on the Beast. So he didn't quite do that. But it was a brutal fight, which I think Hagler was starting to show signs of wear and tear throughout his career. He had a long career. We're talking 62 fights. 62 wins, 2 losses, and 2 draws. So it was in the back end of his career. But the fight was actually supposed to take place in 85, but Hagler done his back in, and then it happened in 86. But there's a couple of things I just got to point before we move on, Sean. There is a story I picked up actually in the Four King book, which did make me laugh. So as I mentioned, Mickey Duff was Mcgaby. He was his trainer. Mcgaby was actually matched early on in his career against a guy called Curtis Ramsey on the Don King. That old Don King keeps popping back up again. He was on the Atlantic City card. Basically, Duffy was trying to get Mcgaby on one of Don King's cards to give him some exposure in America. So the fight takes place. It's sort of, I think it's about his 10th fight, Mcgaby's 10th fight, and Duff had to leave, so he left George Francis in charge of Mcgaby, and he told George to give him a call once the fight had been finished and let him know sort of how it went. So George rings up Duff while he's sort of back at London, and basically John had knocked Ramsey out in the first round. He said that he actually hit him so hard that he knocked Ramsey and referee Larry Hazard out of the ring onto the press table. So, he got his point across. So Don King got on the blower, as he does, spoke to Mickey, he says, hey Mickey, I'm in terms of I'm going to join up with you with Mcgaby. He said, I had a little talk with Mcgaby after the fight, and he says he wants to go with me, but of course I've told him that we're in this together. So Duff sort of allowed King to waffle on. As Duff said, he sort of said, let him get it all out. And then Duff responds with, Don, if that conversation took place, then you must be fluent in Swangali, because the lad don't speak a word of English. So just a little pointer from the Four Kings. But yeah, Mcgaby was a top fighter, and a Hagler, I'll tell you what, it was a tough fight.
It was a tough fight for him. And it was one where I was alluding to the fact where I think you hit the nail on the head. It was where you start to see signs of a little bit of wear and tear with two, brilliant fights in the space of 12 months where, they're the type of fight. They're career shortening fights, aren't they? That's what they say. They're career shortening fights. And they were definitely career shortening fights for Hagler, obviously, who was going into, like you said, a long career. He'd had so many fights at this point before the Ray Leonard fight that eventually, things would catch up with him. And it was not expected to catch up with him in this particular fight with Ray Leonard, because obviously at this point, Hagler is the beast. He's the one of the division. He's the one that rules the division. He's the one that people fear in the division. And for Ray Leonard, it was a different story, really, looking at Ray Leonard's career, because obviously he was in and out of the ring a lot, throughout the 80s. The late 70s, fantastic. He obviously did well in the Olympics, of course. Comes through, has some great fights, has a great fight with Tommy Hearns and Roberto Duran in 80 and 81. And then obviously we got to look at some of the other fights he was involved in the lead up to that. After the Hearns fight, he had another fight against Bruce Finch, which was to defend the WBC and WBA welterweight titles. And then after that, he didn't fight for 2 years. And then he come back and fought Kevin Howard, which was basically this was like the start of his retirements and unretirements. And obviously he comes back and he beats Kevin Howard after 2 years out of the ring. Then when beating Kevin Howard, he retires. He says, that's it, I'm done and dusted for boxing. I don't want anything more to do with it. And then we get to the Marvin Hagler John Mcgaby fight, and he sat there ringside and he's watching this fight, and he sat alongside one of the biggest stars of the 80s at the time, Michael J. Fox. And he sat there, and Leonard said, we were sitting there having a few beers and I'm watching John the Beast Mcgaby outbox Hagler. Of all people, John the Beast Mcgaby. Now, I'd had a few beers at this point, and I said to Michael, I can beat Hagler. And he said, Ray, do you want another beer? And he said, yes, I do, but I can beat Hagler. So that was the first time where he'd started to have these thoughts about the fact that he felt, looking at this guy Hagler in the ring, he's not as feared as what people make him out to be. Leonard saw something in him watching the fight with Mcgaby, which is what we were talking about. He saw something in him, shot worn a little bit maybe. Maybe he was a little bit limited in what he could do against a guy like Ray Leonard. So he decides at this point, he's sort of toying with the idea of coming back. And then on May the 1st, 1986, he's interviewed by a TV station in Washington, and he's made his desire to come back and fight Hagler public at this point. And he's saying to the public, I know exactly what it takes to beat the man. So this is where we start to get a lot of interest riding on the fight. This is where we start to get Ray Leonard pushing himself back out there, essentially. But you've got to remember at this point, he'd been out of the ring for 2 years in 1986. He'd not been competing professionally at this point. And then eventually, in the August of 1986, Hagler announced that he would fight Leonard, and the fight was officially announced at a press conference on November the 3rd, 1986. So finally, after all the talk, all the rumours, it was going to happen. Now we've got to remember at this point, we didn't have social media, we didn't have all the tools that we have today to be able to promote fights in a certain way. This was more about news magazines and newspapers and interviews in newspapers, and this is the way fights were kind of promoted to each other. Someone would say something to a journalist, it'd go in the paper, that fight would read it and go, what the fuck, I want a piece of this guy, and then that's how it would all sort of come about, and that's where all the promoters, of course, would get involved. But for Ray Leonard, he'd been out of the ring for 3 years, but this is what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks about this fight, that, Ray Leonard, he'd been out of the ring for 3 years. Actually, he'd not. I don't know if you know this yourself, but a lot of people didn't realise that behind the scenes, when this fight was announced, he actually started having, behind closed doors, exhibition bouts, which had no head guards. It basically wasn't like sparring, it was exhibition bouts behind closed doors, and they had referees involved, and everything. It was all legitimate, but it didn't go against his record. It was exhibition, so it would never count on his professional record. So actually, it's something that not a lot of people knew about. Everyone thinks this story behind, Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard is, wow, Ray Leonard was out of the ring for 3 years and, he comes back and he beats Marvin Hagler, who was the king of the middleweights at the time. But actually, the story behind it is that he was actually having bouts in the lead up to this particular fight, preparing himself, shaking the ring rust off. And it was something that I was fascinated to hear and read about when doing the research for this episode. I didn't know that, this actually happened in the background. I thought the same as what a lot of other people thought, which was this guy had come back after 3 years out of the ring and he still got it. That was amazing to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he had one fight in 5 years on the record, but as you suggested, absolutely, he had several real fights behind closed doors with gloves, with rounds and judges and referees, with no headgear. There was even a rumour that it was never against actually one opponent. So you'd have one opponent in the ring for 3 rounds or 4 rounds, and then one would leave and the next one would come in on the break. So, he was working his magic behind closed doors. I mean, he had been sort of leading Marvin on he had him on the end of a string for a long time, Leonard did. I mean, even going way back to 73 when, that they were in the amateurs, there was a host of some top fighters in the 73, amateur competition, the AAU in if I remember rightly, I think it was Boston. So you had like the top names like Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, the Spinks brothers, Aaron Pryor, and it was Hagler that actually won his tournament. He was the only one. He won it at £165, and that's when he turned pro. He said, right, you can't take a trophy and turn it into a bag of groceries, he said, so win or lose, I'm turning pro, and he went pro straight away. Obviously, we all know that obviously Leonard went on to do what he did in Montreal and won the gold medal. On just for instance, at Leonard, on his debut, he earned 40,000, whereas Hagler only earned 40 quid, or I say $40, I should say. So, there was a bit of resentment there from Hagler, where he said, like, I had to learn the hard way, whereas Leonard was like a silver spoon kind of guy. But, even back in November 82, when, Leonard, he decided to hold this charity event in Baltimore, Maryland, it actually weren't far from my birthday, because Aaron Pryor and Aguero were fighting that weekend as well. Not that I remember, obviously, I was born in 82. But, he made this announcement that, what's he going to be doing? Is he going to be fighting or not? He asked Hagler to come along. Hagler to sit in the crowd, and you're sort of thinking all the possibilities there. Obviously, I wasn't thinking it, but I think the public were that hopefully that he's going to announce the fight rather than his retirement. And he starts sort of mentioning, Hagler's this great champion, and if they fought, it'd be the biggest fight in boxing history, and blah blah blah. And then, but he says, unfortunately, it will never happen. And he just says, "Thank you, God bless," and that's it. So it's a bit of it was a complete anticlimax, and Hagler's in the crowd. I mean, this is 82. This is 5 years earlier. So Hagler's sort of thinking, well, what the hell was this all about? I mean, rumour has it later on, years later, that during his spell out of the ring, Leonard did become a bit of a, he got on the old cocaine and booze, and he was hanging about with celebrities. This is the 80s. This isn't like how it is today. This is how it rolls. You know what I mean? This is what happens. It was booming at the time. So, he was having his own troubles at the time. So, but Hagler carried on, done what he does next. He held his titles. He picked up the win against Mcgaby, and in the end, Hagler's sort of debating after that performance, maybe I should knock it on the head. But Leonard just continually kept pulling him out. It was actually, I believe it was like a couple of months after the Mcgaby fight, and Hagler's sort of looking and thinking, debating whether he's going to retire. And Leonard actually opened up a restaurant with one of his main guys. I always forget the guy's name, and I shouldn't really. Mike Trainer. So he opens up a restaurant, and he asked Hagler to come along for the grand opening. He picks him up from the airport, and they're sort of sitting there having drinks. And sort of Ray's asking, so what are you going to do next? And Hagler sort of responds, I don't know, Ray, like, I'm finding it hard to get motivated. Sort of Leonard responds like, no shit, and just pours him another glass of champagne, because in his head, he's putting this wonderful plan together, this master plan that, he's doing. And I actually think it was about a week after that he's actually in there doing these sparring sessions, exactly as you mentioned. So Hagler was, I don't know whether he was, as I say, it was on the end of a shoestring. He dangled a carrot in 82, and he sort of just continued to do it throughout Hagler's career. Obviously, Leonard, although not active, was active on HBO as a commentator and a co-presenter. So, he was always there and thereabouts. But, as you say, one fight in 5 years. It looks terrific on paper, but in actual fact, Leonard was waiting for that moment that Hagler would start to decline, and then that was when he was going to call upon him.
Are we suggesting then that maybe he was doing a bit of what people say Floyd Mayweather has done throughout the back end of his career, where he's got the fighters where he's wanted him, and he's chosen to fight the fighters at the time where he feels it's going to be most beneficial to him, and that's kind of what it feels like. That's kind of what it sounds like looking back and going through the research of what was going on at the time and the stories and all the different accounts of what was happening. It feels like there was this big carrot dangling, but it was all, like you say, part of a plan to lure him into this fight. Because the thing is, with this particular fight, not only was it going to be a big fight for boxing, but in terms of monetary value, it was huge. Absolutely huge. Hagler was going to be guaranteed $12 million plus a percentage of the revenue. So that's $12 million plus a percentage of the revenue as well. Leonard was also guaranteed $11 million plus 50% of the closed circuit television rights in the Baltimore, Washington area. So this was going to be going on pay-per-view. It was a big fight, and they got some great negotiations going on there, both earning a hell of a lot of money for this particular fight, which is why they build it the Superfight, essentially. Hagler actually ended up with about 20 million. Leonard ended up with about 12. But because Leonard had agreed to let Hagler have the larger purse, he was the one that was coming off the layoff, essentially. He was the one that had moved up in the weight. Remember, he was a welterweight. He was naturally a welterweight, so he was jumping up to middleweight. So he sort of conceded part of the negotiation to allow Hagler to get paid more. And from Hagler's perspective, it's quite a smart move looking back, thinking about it, because obviously if he feels like he was coming to the end of his career at this point, he wants the big financial security to move on with his life, doesn't he? So accepting the larger purse was probably the right thing in hindsight. However, because he conceded the money aspect of it, that meant that Ray Leonard's team could pick the gloves, which was a 10-ounce Reyes gloves, and a number of rounds as well. Normally, still at this point in time, there were 15-round fights going on. This actually turned out to be scheduled for 12 rounds, and then he also got the opportunity to pick the size of the ring, which was a 20-foot ring, which was strategically for him the right thing to do, as we will go into in the fight breakdown. We'll talk about the use of the ring and the use of the movement for Ray Leonard, because that's what he was all about in his career. So this was absolutely huge, and when it was announced, when the interview started taking place, it was, Ray Leonard was as cocky and as confident as ever. He felt like he was going to come back and he was going to be able to do a number on Hagler. He felt like he'd seen everything that he needed to see to go in there and beat him, and that's what the interviews talk about when they come across.
All along, I wanted to fight Hagler, not a career. I didn't want a career anymore because I had a quite illustrious career, and I just didn't know how to break the news to the media or to the public to say I want to fight Hagler, because they would have been saying what they're saying now. You're crazy.
I've been waiting, I tell you, for a long time. And like I said, I think that this is my time, this is my era, this is my day for me to shine.
I'm doing something I always felt I could do. It's no surprise to me. Sounds a little cocky, doesn't it? But it's me. I mean, I feel that good. I feel that confident about my progress and about my conditioning.
I'm going to stop him. I don't know which round it's going to be in. I'm going to stop him.
He won't outstrength me. I mean, again, people say, well, Ray, you're a little guy. I'm 30 years old. I'm not old, but I'm a much older guy, so I carry my weight fine.
You better sit there and get your popcorn early. I told you, your beers and whatever, and sit tight, because this fight don't necessarily have to go 12 rounds.
I'd like to take this time to wish Marvin and Bertha and their family Godspeed and all of that good stuff, because they are truly wonderful people. We've had the pleasure of meeting them and talking with them, and I really do like them. They're nice people.
This man wants to knock my head off, Juanita.
That doesn't take away the fact that they're nice people, honey.
He wants to hurt me bad.
But then from Hagler's perspective, he was like, he was all war Hagler at this point, weren't he? So he was, I'm going to knock Ray Leonard out. He was wanting to knock him out. He was wanting to do a number on him and then sail into the sunset with all that money. But he wanted to knock Ray Leonard out. And Ray Leonard, obviously, he was very brash, a little bit arrogant, and, it came across. But Ray Leonard could back things up in the ring. That was the difference. He could back things up in the ring, but no one was expecting Ray to come out of 3-year layoff and go into the fight and actually have the opportunity to potentially win this fight. A lot of people were actually thinking Hagler's the one that's on form at the moment. Hagler's the one that's got the titles. He's the guy that people are fearing in the middleweight division. On paper, it looks like it's a Hagler win because, you know, Ray Leonard's jumping up the weights. He's been out of the ring professionally for 3 years. And to me, on paper, you think to yourself, yeah, that's quite obvious that what's going to happen, isn't it? But, you know, it's Ray Leonard, and you know, what people didn't know is Ray Leonard was training in the background and he was getting himself ready and he was having all these little exhibition fights, preparing, getting the ring rust off. We didn't know about that. This was happening behind closed doors, so it was amazing to look back on and find out all these little intricate stories of what actually happened. So the build up to it is so good to listen to and so good to hear about. That there's so many intricate details. So moving on, as part of the build up, then you mentioned earlier the fight took place at the outdoor arena, Caesar's Palace, which you didn't really get to see a lot of that. It seemed to be a sort of mid-80s to mid-90s venue where people loved it. I mean, they had obviously this fight there. They went on to have a WrestleMania there. You know, it was a big thing back in that period of time. But the ticket prices at the time were $700, $600, $500, $400, $200 and $100. And the fight actually sold out in 16 days. And they were basically saying they had to turn away some of their better customers because the demand was so great. And this is what a Caesar's Palace spokesman was quoted as saying. So a paying crowd of 12,379 people generated a live gate of a staggering 6.2 million. That's amazing. That sort of money that they generated for this fight at this time.
Oh, unbelievable. I mean, you say that according to Bob Arum that the actual fight grossed $78 million. So the money that, you know, during '87, I mean, this is substantial amounts of money. I mean, I don't even know how much that is in today's money, but it is a lot, basically, a hell of a lot. I mean, it was a huge fight. You know, as you mentioned before, with you know, Hagler was a clear favourite. He was the favourite. It was the betting favourite. It was 4-1. Not many people felt that Leonard had a chance. By the day of the fight, the odds actually fell to 3-1. So, you know, you could see that slowly people were starting to maybe think, well, you know, this is Leonard we're talking about here. This isn't just some random fella. This is a guy that's class, in his world class. I mean, even saying that, I mean, this fight for me sort of put Leonard into that top category alongside sort of like Muhammad Ali, if you like, because of how long he had been out of the ring, and just to stay 12 rounds with someone like Hagler, who was so ruthless. You know, he's making his 12th title defence, albeit of only the WBC strap, because the WBA stripped Hagler because he wouldn't fight Harold Bomber Graham, another one of ours, UK boys. Harold Graham, if anyone don't know who he is, go and check out some of his stuff because he's a fantastic fighter. And he was actually ranked as the #1 contender. So, you know, WBA stripped Hagler. The IBF did not sanction the fight because they refused to because basically Ray weren't ranked. So for them, you know, it was, you know, it's not a fight. They're not going to put their title on the line. But obviously, if Hagler had lost, then he loses the title becomes vacant. So he's only the one title. So although, you know, Hagler was the undisputed middleweight champion of the world, the WBO was around at the time, I believe. I'm not 100% sure, but it was nowhere near as significant as the other three. But I mean, even down to sort of Hagler. The thing with Hagler was that he was offered this fight after the Mcgaby fight, a few months after, and you know, as you mentioned, he had that interview with Leonard, and he pushed the fight out, and he actually took 109 days terms, you know, to accept the offer. Leonard basically said that it's only because, you know, he doesn't fancy it, and then sort of Hagler come back with, you know, he's been stringing me along for 4 years. Jesus Christ, you know what I mean? What, you know, I think he hasn't wanted it. But so Hagler actually, you know, went into a 10-week training camp, which is unlikely. Apparently, that was his longest ever training camp. He went into a 10-week training camp and he shut out the press completely. He didn't want anyone to know what he was up to and what he was doing. So again, Leonard playing his tricks. I mean, he knew Hagler. They were friends. They had known each other for a long time. As I said, like, he picked up from the airport to do the opening of his restaurant. They had, you know, they were friends in a way. They liked each other. And I believe Hagler probably felt that, you know, Leonard was never going to return. So when he realised he's like, well, I'm going to lock myself away, I'm going to work hard. So Leonard being Leonard, like you said, like the Mayweather tactics, he actually sent in a spy, a guy called J.D. Brown. So he sent in a spy for 3 days, and he actually got a picture deliberately taken with Marvin, just so he could prove to Marvin that he had actually sent in a spy to watch him. So that pissed off Hagler. He was absolutely, he was just, he couldn't believe that he's just got this absolutely, this bottle to do this to him. But in actual fact, J.D. Brown actually brought back some useful information. Basically, he said that Mike Weaver, who was a heavyweight around the time, and his brothers, the Weaver trio, or that they used to call him, were actually sparring with Hagler, and they said that he was getting frustrated and was cussing them when they were on their feet. They were on the run. Basically, they were moving about the ring. So it was those type of little twinges that sort of sparked this something in Leonard's head and his team. And obviously Angelo Dundee was a very intelligent trainer. So these little bits that happened, and this information he's getting back, it sort of, it just sparked this master plan. And the only other thing, the second thing to come out of it was that Hagler liked to take the centre ring from the start of the fight. So if Leonard sort of had a feeling that if I could go in there and take the centre ring early doors, then maybe he could get himself a substantial lead enough to be able to take the fight. So, it was interesting. Although he's playing mind games, he actually come back with a couple of useful bits of information.
Yeah, that's amazing. Another story there that you might have not just picked up from searching. I mean, I'm sure it's in the depths of the internet somewhere, but it's great to get real insight into how much went on, mind games psychologically went on at the time to push for this fight to be so big. And I mean, what would have happened if we would have had social media for a fight like this? It would have been going through the roof. It would have been going through the roof. So going back to the obviously careers for the build up to the fight, Hagler had not actually lost a fight since dropping a 10-round unanimous decision to Willie Monroe in 1976, and then he would go on to beat Monroe twice in 77. But then he was undefeated for 11 years until he obviously met Ray, and we had the fight that we're talking about. But for Ray Leonard, it was a little bit of a different story. I alluded to the fact he was involved in great fights with Duran earlier on in his career, with Tommy Hearns, but there was a reason why he ended up having to retire the first time round. He had to retire because he had to have repairs done on a detached retina in his left eye. So when he did return in 1984 and defeated Kevin Howard, he wasn't the same. He'd suffered the first professional knockdown of his career. So people were looking at it like, he's not the same fighter anymore. He's a bit washed up. He's this, he's that. So obviously he goes back into retirement. And as we've been talking about, it's the whole stringing Hagler along for so many years before actually Hagler had enough and he really wanted this fight. So it had been an amazing journey for both men. And although Leonard had actually been medically cleared for the fight with Hagler, there's a lot of people that felt his safety was paramount and that he shouldn't actually go in the ring with a guy who was ferocious and a guy who was hitting so hard and hurting a lot of people. He shouldn't have, basically didn't think Leonard was going to go in there and survive against a guy. They felt like he was going to end up suffering a serious injury, especially to the eye that had been rectified. So there was a big potential and a big risk for Ray Leonard, really taking that risk to go into there and potentially getting a life-changing injury as well, which when you think about what boxing's like today in this day and age, we've seen people like Kell Brook with his broken orbital bone in his face, and on both sides as well with Kell Brook. So these are quite serious injuries, and they do really they can really affect your career because it's your eyesight, of course. And if they don't clear you to fight, then that's you over, really. But Leonard was actually cleared for the fight, but a lot of people felt like this is a big risk going in there with a guy who can punch really hard, who can potentially break your orbital bone, detach your retina again, and then you could end up losing the sight in your eye, and that's a life-changing injury. Then you'd never be able to come back from that. So it was a huge risk that he was going to take, but it was a risk that he felt like it was going to pay off. But let's just take a little pause for one moment to give a shout out to the sponsors for BTR Boxing Podcast. It's Bear Attack Boxing, providing high quality boxing gloves, boxing equipment to your suitable needs. You can find them at www.bearattackboxing.co.uk and all over social media. You've got the Fight Pro 1 gloves, the Pluto gloves, the new Bear Attack Boxing t-shirt range, the inner gloves, the hand wraps, some great boxing products on there. So go and check them out. And also, we've got a little present for you. Because you're a loyal listener to BTR Boxing Podcast, we've got an exclusive discount code for you. Now, it's a 10% discount, and all you've got to do is when you're at the checkout and you've got them boxing gloves and that t-shirt in there that you want to buy, go onto the promo code and enter BTR10 for 10% off. And 10% is not something to be scoffed at in this day and age. It can definitely get you a few quid off them high quality products that Bear Attack Boxing are selling. So, as a loyal listener to BTR Boxing Podcast, when you buy or purchase something through Bear Attack Boxing's website, in the promo code, enter BTR10 and you will get an exclusive 10% discount off your basket. So please go and take advantage of it. Follow them on social media, Bear Attack Boxing, and it's bearattackboxing.co.uk.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was always the problem. I mean, but on both sides. I mean, for Leonard especially. I mean, I think when he phoned his brother, he told him he's going to be fighting Hagler. His brother said, "Okay, right. So who are you fighting first?" And he sort of said, "Nobody. I'm going straight in." And he was like, "Are you fucking mad?" Because he's like, you need that Walmart fight, brother. And he's like, "No, I'm doing it." So, and also before that Kevin Howard fight, he actually had, that fight was rescheduled as well, or postponed, because he actually needed a minor surgery because of, also, there was like a loose retina. He had to fix a loose retina in the right eye. So blatantly, there was, he had those issues with his eyes. And then for Hagler's side, I mean, what he was, I've read recently, he was sort of seeing it as, well, actually, although I've been chasing the money, because that's basically what he wanted. He wanted to get that. He wanted to be established. I think after the Hearns fight, he was clearly established. It took him a long time. I mean, winning that first title over here against Alan Minter. I mean, but, it was incredible, really, that it took him as many fights as it was to actually win a title, which, if anyone's never seen the Alan Minter fight when he actually first wins that first world title, he stops him on cuts, but the crowd, it's chaos at Wembley Arena. They're literally lobbing bottles and glasses, and even Harry Carpenter's at ringside saying, "Oh, getting drenched in beer," and the actual police had to escort sort of Hagler and his team out of the ring. So he couldn't even celebrate that victory. But it was weird that, there was an image about Hagler. He didn't have the same image as a Sugar Ray Leonard, almost like, people were likened him to like a Sam Cooke, that nice looking guy he had all the fundamentals, he spoke well, so he was easy to be able to expose and to just, promote basically, whereas Hagler wasn't. So it took him a long time, and eventually he gets this big payday after so many years of Leonard sort of dangling his carrot in front of him, and you're sort of thinking, God, he's in the end, I think he took him 109 days to respond, because he was like, I'm going to keep him waiting for a little while. But then the other thing, what Hagler said, was that even if I beat him, we're talking about a guy with a damaged eye that's actually a blown-up welterweight. Is anyone going to actually really, what there's going to be an asterisk against his name, because actually he's beaten he's basically beaten a welterweight with one eye. So he was in a no-win situation, really, Hagler. It was the money that was talking. He was on his 12th defence. He was trying to hunt down Carlos Monzon, 14 defences. So it was really tricky for Hagler, and Leonard played into that, and he, as you say, a bit like the Mayweather, he played those mind games, and he waited for his moment, and he picked it right. And although he did have the eye problem, I think he even said himself that his eye was okay. You still don't know. He's talking about a devastating guy. Probably, if not the best middleweight in boxing, he's at least in your top three, because Hagler was an outstanding middleweight. And rightfully, he finally started to get his just rewards. But it was interesting to see how this fight was going to develop. And yeah, it was a super fight, and it's exactly what it was. And they accommodated the thousands to watch in attendance, and obviously everyone in the closed doors to watch behind closed doors in the cinemas and theatres. So great. I mean, we weren't around at the time, but it must have been absolutely amazing.
Yeah, 100%. Let's look at a couple of little figures then going into the fight before we start talking about the breakdown of the fight. So more than 1,000 reporters and photographers from 32 different countries received press credentials for this fight. That's the magnitude of how big the fight was, that every man and his dog from every country, from every newspaper, from whatever media outlet was there at the time, wanted to be at this fight, and over 1,000 reporters / photographers got accreditation for it, which I thought was, amazing, really. I mean, you struggle to get it in this day and age, to be honest with you, but then they obviously accommodated the press maybe a little bit better than what they do today, because that's a hell of a lot of reporters and photographers to be able to accredit for a fight. And then also they did a poll of obviously the famous writers around at the time covering the fight, 18 of them 21 writers picked Hagler to win, but only 3 picked Sugar Ray Leonard to win the fight. And the betting odds were also interesting. The betting odds opened as a 4-1 favourite for Hagler when it was announced, but on the day of the fight, it actually dropped slightly from 4-1 to 3-1. And also, Hagler is the number 1 pound-for-pound boxer in the world at this point. Not just middleweight, he was the number 1 pound-for-pound rated boxer in the world. That was by KO magazine. That is amazing. You know, thinking about it, on paper, the odds are stacked against Sugar Ray Leonard in this one. Completely stacked against him. This is all telling you a story of this is a guy who's going to go in there and be a guy who thinks he's still got something left. And that's what I would have been feeling at the time. If we was doing a preview episode for this particular fight, you'd have been sat there thinking, this is all going to go in Hagler's favour. Hagler's going to probably beat him in 12 rounds, or he's probably going to stop him late on him. It wouldn't have surprised me. That's the type of stuff we probably would have said about this fight at the time if we was covering it for a preview episode. So when you look at it in perspective like that, this is how much everybody had Hagler winning this particular fight. Practically, you know, two-thirds, if not more than two-thirds of people were saying, you know, this is Hagler's win, this is him, he's going to put Ray back into retirement, this is the end of it. And I think he even said it himself, Hagler's going to send him back into retirement in the build-up to it. So, you know, on paper, this was a Marvin Hagler win. So the fight itself then, Johnston, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how good of a fight this ended up being, because it was billed as a super fight, and it was a super fight.
It really was. It was a great fight. It was a very technical fight. You know, it was like the main event of the Four Kings, if you like. You know, we covered Duran and Leonard in the early. That was like the first fight of them all. And for me, this was like the last one. I know Hearns obviously went on to fight Leonard, but you know, that was another great fight, the second fight. But for me, this was like the main event of the lot. And it was a great technical fight. I mean, for me, you know, Hagler. One thing I noticed straight from the off, you know, natural southpaw, and he comes out fighting orthodox, which was unusual, because he done it against Mcgaby, where he come out as an orthodox fighter, as a right-hander, because he felt that he was going to try and confuse Mcgaby, which didn't work. So I was surprised that he would do the same tactic against Leonard. But Leonard was too quick, too slick. He was dancing, he was moving, he was making Hagler miss. Leonard was on his toes, he was keeping out of danger, and then sort of when Hagler did get close enough, he would clinch. And it was pretty much for the first. I mean, I had for the first 4 rounds, but you know, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you know, it was pretty. I wouldn't say easy for Leonard, but what he did do was, you know, he made Hagler work, and he done all the right things. He used that big ring that he decided he needed in the negotiations.
First punch by Hagler, clean miss, nice combination by Leonard, and Hagler's talking to him and smiling at him.
Hagler said he expected to get hit, he just wasn't too concerned about it. I'll take anything he can throw. Leonard has used all of this more than 21-foot ring so far. A brief flurry, no damage. Hagler content to cut off the ring, and Leonard
Good
with a
right hand. Good right, solid right hand by Leonard. Now Leonard's boxing southpaw, trying to do a psych job on Marvelous Marvin, and now Hagler's boxing southpaw. Tough to keep up with these guys. There's the shots.
Left and a right. Hagler waiting for the break, under 30 seconds, round 1.
That's him right now. Leonard is floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee. But can he keep it up? Fainting, moving, fainting.
Well, you look at them first 4 rounds, and he came out, and I think he surprised not only a lot of people in the audience and the journalists, he surprised Hagler, because Hagler, I wouldn't say they underestimated him, but they obviously feel he didn't have enough left to be able to go in there and stick it with Hagler. But the way he came out, as you said, he was moving around the ring, he was using that full 20-foot ring to his advantage, and he was making Hagler chase him down, he was making him trying to cut the ring off. And it was interesting that he came out as an orthodox rather than a southpaw. I mean, that obviously quickly changed. I can't remember which particular round it was, 2nd, 3rd or 4th. I know I know they quickly changed it when they realised it really weren't working. But I think even if he would have started the fight as a southpaw, even for the first couple of rounds, I still think it wouldn't have made a difference to the fight, because I think Leonard came out with the intention of hit and not being hit himself. He was going to go in there and he wasn't going to engage in a war. He wasn't going to bring himself into Hagler's trenches. He was going to go in there and he was going to use all the advantages and all the skills he had and had built up over the years, regardless of him being out of the ring for so long. I mean, you've got to remember as well, I keep saying this, but we didn't know, and people didn't know at the time, that Leonard was actually having all these fights behind closed doors. The general public wouldn't have known that, because there wouldn't have been anyone communicating that out at the time. I mean, if there was, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can see from doing the research on this, nobody knew about this other than people in boxing. So the general public who'd paid for this fight, who'd come to watch this fight, they didn't know that Ray Leonard was getting all this training in the background. They didn't know he was competing, essentially. Although it wasn't on his professional record, exhibition bouts are still shaking that ring rust off. And when you were talking about having different fighters in on the same night when he was in the ring, that is basically how you get yourself firing sharp again. And this shown on the night. So them first 4 rounds, he just basically mugged Hagler off. He just Hagler's just thinking, right, what have I got to do to get to this guy? I want to try and cut the ring off, and I want to try and land, and he just couldn't land, and he was struggling to land, and Ray Leonard just looked so slick and so on point. And you're thinking to yourself in the first 4 rounds, you're thinking, wow, Ray Leonard's been out of the ring for 3 years here. How the hell is he outboxing Marvin Hagler?
Well, he was as smooth as you like, wasn't he? He had that game plan. I mean, people allude to the fact that it was after the Duran Hagler fight that he started to put this plan together. And he actually mentioned to someone, I don't know who it was, but the best way to beat Hagler is to have 15-second bursts, and especially those last 15-20 seconds of the round to put those bursts on him to impress the judges and the crowd, and he was doing that. I mean, to say that, I mean, that wasn't until sort of later in the fight, but that first 4 rounds especially, I mean, he kept out of his way. I mean, it was even in the break in the second that I heard Dundee say to him, you want to be smooth, buddy, and you want to keep it up. You want to keep up your boxing, and that's he was happy. Dundee, it was only Team Leonard that knew exactly what his game plan was, and it was working like a dream. I mean, Hagler did change it. Obviously, he switched his starts. He got a little bit more. He improved his performance slightly in the third, but as you say, it didn't make any difference. Leonard was pretty much in control. The one thing for me, I noticed around the 4th round was that Leonard slowly, I wouldn't say he completely stopped. He was tiring slightly. He weren't going to be able to sustain the quick feet, after not really being out the ring for as long as he had, although he had done the rounds behind closed doors like he did. The fact that the extra weight was going to play its toll, I think it did at that point. And it was towards the end of the 4th round, for instance, that Leonard, but he went up against the rope, and he allowed Hagler to sort of just close the gap a little bit. But even then, he was able to just spin out of danger and just throw those flurry of shots, which were eye-catching. And Hagler was a little bit, he's like a deer in the headlights. He really did know what to do. And at times, I can't help but make it look like, Leonard was like the matador, and Hagler was like the flat-footed bull. So those first 4 rounds in particular were just brilliant from Leonard. And who knows, those 4 rounds were massive. And Hagler, he started slow.
He did start slow, but by the 5th and the 6th, he started to find the range that he was looking for. And Leonard, quite rightly so, was going to start to slow down at some point, regardless of the exhibition bouts he'd been in. There's no different feeling than obviously being in a professional fight against the best fighter essentially on the planet at the time. So it wasn't just like he was fighting guys behind closed doors anymore. He was fighting the best fighter on the planet who was not going to stop coming at him. He was not going to take a breather. This was the work rate of marvellous Marvin Hagler. He was always going to be there from start to finish no matter what. He was going to hunt you down until he knocked you out, or he beat you down for 12 rounds. That was Marvin Hagler. That's what everyone remembers him as. But in the 5th and 6th, then he starts to come back. He starts to get through a little bit more, and Leonard's starting to slow down a little bit now. Obviously, the stamina is sort of starting to wean just a little bit, and he's taking a little bit of a breather, having won them first opening 4 rounds.
Cut by Leonard.
Hagler's starting to get the range a little bit now, though, Tim.
They finally got him in the corner, landed a left.
Seemed like it's just was starting to get the range.
The conditioning of these two athletes is extraordinary. Hagler solid right by Hagler.
He's starting to get the range, Tim. You can just see it.
That one forced Leonard to grab him. No question, Gilbert. Leonard stopped on the ropes for the first time in the fight.
And hit a couple of good body punches. Now he's punching back, but Hagler, Tim, he doesn't belong in there.
Getting to the 7th, and the 7th's where we see a clean hook which rocked Leonard, and you can see he started to sag a little bit, and you're thinking, is this the opening moment that marvellous Marvin Hagler needs? Is this the moment he needs now to get Leonard? So he starts trying to trap Leonard on the ropes, starts throwing the shots in, he's going to the head, he's going to the body, he's looking like he's got Leonard in a lot of trouble, but Leonard, the lucky man that he is.
Hagler getting Leonard in a flat-footed position again, but good movement by Leonard when the punches arrive. And Corey's back. Those were blocked by Hagler in the last game.
Hagler's landing the solid punches at this time, Tim. And Ray is very tired. You know, Tim, when you're a little tired, you're a little better puncher, too. You know, you got to be flat-footed.
Hagler's been able to pick off the last several combinations with his gloves. As he did there. And he smiles and laughs at Leonard, and gives him a grin back.
Oh, and here we go to Muhammad Ali. And a nice combination.
Working on the mind of Hagler. And Hagler just keeps plodding ahead in his workmanlike style.
Those are the solid punches.
Yep.
Those are the solid punches. He has Ray in a little trouble now.
Bang into the body. Uppercut scored at the bell. They don't hear the bell.
The bell saved him. The end of the round saved him in the 7th, because he was getting a bit of a shellacking in that 7th round, and whilst he was avoiding a few of the punches, he was still getting through, and you start to think to yourself, watching the fight back, it's like, you know, this is where you think it could have ended. This is where Hagler's sort of partly best chance was in the fight. So he'd started to pull some rounds back at this point. You know, the 5th, the 6th and the 7th, I would suggest they were Hagler rounds. So at this point you would have probably Ray Leonard a round up at this point. You know, he'd have 4 rounds. Hagler took the 3 rounds after that. And then obviously as we move on into the fight, it starts to get even more tastier, because there's only so long Leonard's going to be able to dance around the ring for and avoid getting hit by Hagler. And as the latter rounds started to come in, the 8th and the 9th, this is where we start to see some amazing action.
Oh yeah, this is where the fight really starts to hot up. Obviously Hagler starts closing the fight, you know, get on the scorecards, you know, as you say, he's pulling it back now, so moving into the 8th, you know, Hagler was starting to get impatient, and rumour has it that he says, you know, he started to talk to Leonard, saying, "Come on, you slug," and Leonard would come back and say, like, "No chance," and be off on his toes again. But, you know, clearly, I mean, even Leonard years later has said that he was actually starting to feel it, and he could start, especially you talk about that 7th round, he hurt Leonard, and Leonard said he hurt me that round, and he pulled that old poker face, and Hagler went back to his corner, and when he had a glance over at Hagler and he doesn't realise that I'm feeling it, he played Hagler, he made Hagler think that he was alright. So, you know, he was, even in the ring, before the fight and in the ring, he's playing mind games. But, you know, in that 8th round, I mean, Hagler sort of chasing Leonard around the ring for a good for the first 90 seconds of the round, when I was sort of trying to time it. He was landing to the body, landing to the head. Not much coming back from Leonard. Leonard then would come back with that late burst, which he was obviously alluding to when he had a conversation sort of prior to fight, a couple of years before, where he wasn't managing to land completely clean. There were some clean. Nothing really hurt Hagler, but it pleased the crowd, it pleased the judges, and I think that was what he was trying to do. It was almost like, you know, he was pulling the wool over everyone's eyes, whereas Hagler's working his arse off, and, you know, Leonard he's got the eye-catching shot. So some people, he's sort of fooling the audience as well. And then round 9, for me, was the round of the fight, you know, most exciting round. Hagler, Leonard crossed in the corner. Leonard was in trouble, and then ferociously tried to fight his way out of the corner, and it just sort of seesaw back and forth for the rest of the round. Both men having their moment, and it was a difficult one to call. It could be an even round. I mean, I tend to go with Hagler because I felt he just did the better work.
Leonard warned for holding again by Richard Steele. Again, Leonard flat-footed on the ropes, but Hagler not getting much done.
He's trying to hit the head. The body doesn't move. Just bang to the body. Nice combination by Ray.
That
was the best punch of the fight.
Hagler straight
best
down
punch
the
of the fight for Hagler.
Hagler backing up Leonard into the Leonard corner. Short right uppercut.
He's nailing him now, Tim.
Right to the chin.
That's where he has to put that left hand.
Leonard in some difficulty. Hasn't thrown a punch out of this corner. Now he does. Trying to bang his way out.
Look at that determination of Ray Leonard. You talk about a champion.
What a display.
Absolutely gritted his teeth. Look at him go.
Again, in the middle of the ring, and Hagler stays there and punches back. A right by Leonard.
What a display, Tim. You talk about a champion, but he's got that solid rock to move, and Hagler just keeps methodically moving forward.
What do you think, Sean? How do you think that round 9 went?
That round 9, I tell you what, that is one of the best rounds of boxing that you will ever see. Now, you've got to look at this whole fight as it was at the time and look at where it was into round 9. So, we've talked about Leonard coming out, winning the early exchanges, winning the early rounds, Hagler starting to pull it back. You're going into the 9th round, you'd probably, for me, just have Leonard edging the fight. It's a very, very close fight at this stage of the fight, and you have Leonard there getting backed up. Now, this is the point where if you're a Hagler fan, you're like, yes, he's getting through, he's going to get to him, he's finally cut the ring off, he's finally got him where he wants him. And when he had Leonard in that corner, man, that was just an amazing exchange of punches, because Hagler's throwing everything he's got into it. He's throwing the kitchen sink at it, he's throwing anything he could to get Leonard. But the way Leonard fought back and fought out of that corner and spun Hagler around was just beautiful to watch. It was really great. It's pure. It's boxing at its purest, where you've got a guy who's coming on, and a guy who's able to fight his way out of the corner like Leonard did. And still, even though he spun Hagler around, Hagler's still coming at him, and Hagler's still going for him, and he's still throwing the punches, and he's really pushing for a stoppage. He's really unloading the tank here. And again, Leonard, he's fighting on the back foot, but he's throwing these flurries that are stopping Hagler in his stride. And it was so important that he did that, because I think that was a very pivotal moment of the fight for me, because I feel like this is where Hagler had unloaded everything he had to give, and Leonard was able to just come back with something which was more than enough to keep Hagler at bay. And this is, for me, was where the fight really turned on its head, in terms of these later rounds were going to be absolutely vital, because it was a very close fight. For me, at this point, I know obviously we'll come on to the judges' scorecards at the end, but for me at this point, I found it quite close, as in probably a couple of rounds in it. I mean, I had Leonard probably winning a couple of rounds at this, but it was still very, very close. So that 9th round was really pivotal, and then obviously the 10th and the 11th, we get more of the same, really. We get more of Leonard trying to control the fight a little bit more. He's trying to steal the rounds, and you know, we've seen him do this in fights before. We'd seen him do it in some of his most masterful performances, where, you know, he's getting to the last 30 seconds of a round and he's throwing them combinations and getting out, and he's the one that's looking the eye-catching fighter. And it does look like the Matador and the Bull, because he's getting these flurries in, he's walking away, the Bull, as in Hagler's, coming at him but not landing anything.
Yeah, it's exactly how it was going. I mean, for me, Hagler, they had that 10th round off. After that 9th, after such a hard-fought round, as you rightly mentioned, it was one of the best rounds of boxing you could watch. I mean, outstanding from both in terms of technical ability and just the amount of will they put in and desire. But the constant pressure from Hagler, for me, you know, he was working Leonard. Leonard was throwing combos back, but it wasn't enough conviction or enough authority for me, in my opinion. So I felt that Hagler started to nip. Well, I think he won those rounds. I think for me, from round 10, 11 and 10, 11 and 12, I mean, even from 9, I give it to Hagler as well. But I can understand where people would want to go with Leonard, because of he just looked more flashier. He looked more effective. Even the commentators as well. You know, it was almost like they were sort of neglecting the work that Hagler was putting in. You know, he was working and he was trying to get close. At times he was landing to the head and body, and then Leonard would just come back with those eye-catching shots. I mean, in the final round, for me, Leonard thinks he's won the fight. Leonard doesn't do enough in that 12th round whatsoever. So Leonard obviously felt that he had done enough and he was on his bike, and he basically done that for pretty much that 12th round. Hagler landed to the head, landed to the body. Leonard came back with a flurry that sort of, it looked like it just tickled him more than anything. Hagler didn't hurt Hagler in any way whatsoever.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the decision of the judges. We have a split decision. Judge Lou Filippo scores the bout. 115, Marvin Hagler. 113, Ray Leonard. Judge Jojo Guerra scores the bout. 118, Leonard. 110, Hagler. And Judge Dave Moretti scores 115, 113. By the winner, by a split decision, and new middleweight champion of the world, Sugar Ray Leonard.
It's difficult. I mean, I can see why people would feel that Leonard did enough. It's a tight fight. You could go either way. I just felt that, you know, for me, the aggressor for Hagler, he was the champion as well. And I do think at times when Leonard got tired, I just don't think he did enough. And for me, you know, when I try and score a fight, I try and score it by a minute. Those 3 minutes, I'll do it by minute, by minute. And, you know, if someone's had 2 minutes of that round, I'm not going to then go and give it to Leonard for his last 30-second burst. So that's how I scored it. So that's why I felt that Hagler basically won those last 3 rounds, which won him the fight. But obviously, you know, we'll go into the scorecards later. So I don't know. What was your assessment, Sean?
You know, this is where we get a good bit of conversation now, because I actually felt like watching that fight back, I felt Ray Leonard won it. I did feel he won the fight. Watching it back again, this was probably the only second or third time I'd ever watched this fight in my life. And when I watched it back and I tried to be a lot more objective than what I've ever been before. I think the previous times I'd watched this fight, I'd never tried to look at it from a perspective of trying to score the fight, so to speak. So when I watched it back, I was making a little note of each round and thinking, you know, actually this, you know, because I knew how controversial some people saw the decision. I felt like I needed to make sure I got some real insight into this. And by the time the end of the 12th round come, I felt like Ray Leonard had won the fight. I felt like he'd won it by a few rounds. I felt the early rounds, them first 4 rounds, which we both spoke about, were key to winning this fight, because he took them early rounds. Yeah. And Hagler's game plan he didn't come out fighting southpaw, he come out fighting orthodox. Second, third round, he had to change. He's already a couple of rounds down at this point as well, so then he's having to pull it back, and he's having to fight to pull it back. And yes, he had the champion's advantage, but what is champion's advantage? You know, that's another question. It's another can of worms. For me, Ray Leonard, he did enough to win the fight by 3, maybe even 4 rounds, depending on how you interpreted the fight. For me, he won the fight. The only thing which we come onto the cards now is, the only thing that I don't agree with is there was one particular judge who scored the fight 118, 110, which I thought was an absolute travesty. That's the part of boxing that still happens today. A card in which a fighter has won 8 rounds to 4 rounds, that was not the case. Leonard didn't win 8 rounds of that fight. No chance did he win 8 rounds of that fight against Hagler's 4. The most likely scorecard on there that I will agree with is the 115, 113 card from Dave Moretti, which he gave to Ray Leonard. That was the card where you could sit there and say, actually, yeah, you can probably accept that. But you obviously feel different. You feel like Hagler's aggression was what won him the fight, and this is the beauty of it, because people interpret fights in a totally different way. And I'm normally a guy who loves the aggressive style, but as time's gone on, I've learned to appreciate the art of the sport and the hit and not be hit. And the way Leonard, for me, in them sort of early to mid rounds, was able to get in the pocket and get out of the pocket and land the eye-catching combinations was what won him the fight. For me, it's essentially what won Ray Leonard this particular fight. Body language at the end of the fight told the story. Again, and I always talk about this with every fight we cover, whether it be Legendary Nights or whether it be a most recent fight. When you see the body language at the end of the fight, you can tell that the fighter knows they've won and the fighter that's lost knows they've lost, because you just go back to the corner. There's no celebrations. There's no, you know, even trying to put on a false sense of the fact that they've won. But no, Ray Leonard, he knew he'd won the fight. He knew he'd done enough to win the fight at the end of this. So for me, Ray Leonard did win the fight, and he won it by a couple of rounds. It was a close. It probably could have been worse for Marvin Hagler should there have been different judges there on the night. But for me, I did think Dave Moretti's card for Ray Leonard was the most accurate card on the night.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you. I mean, the first time I watched it, I thought it was a draw, and I didn't sit there scoring it. I just felt that it was pretty even, and I couldn't really call it. You know, even you say about body language. I mean, Hagler done this weird dance, which, you know, very uncharacteristic of Hagler.
Exactly.
You know, they say black men have got rhythm. He's got no fucking rhythm. It was dreadful. So, you know, clearly I think he got fooled himself, Hagler. So I just feel that maybe he, you know, I mean, he came out and said that afterwards when they embraced, he said, Leonard said, "You beat me, man." And then sort of Hagler, that's what Hagler said. And then Leonard come out and said, "No, I didn't say that at all. I said it was you're a great champion." And then when the HBO cameras and microphones back, actually, they went in and probably got mimers, and you know what they're like. Jesus Christ. And then they actually believed and supported Hagler's version of events. Either way, you know, I think the body language is a clear indication of it. I just feel that Leonard sort of, for me, I think he pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. I don't think anybody expected Leonard, as you clearly said, in one fight in 5 years to be able to do what he did against Marvin Hagler. I mean, it shows how great he is as a superstar. I mean, he was outstanding in all of his fights, really, apart from the latter stages of his career. But what he did very well. And for me, again, on the other side of it, did Hagler really, you know, he didn't put that performance in that he did against Hearns. You know, if he'd have gone in and tried to walk Leonard down as ferocious as he was, maybe we're talking about a different fight here. I think Hagler probably, maybe the mind games just messed with him a little bit, because he was very cautious, and Hagler wasn't necessarily the most cautious of fighters, and it you know, that didn't work in his favour. So I went 1-1-15, 1-1-13 Hagler. So you went the other way. You know, people have called it a draw. It could be a draw. Who knows? I mean, the fight in the end was named Fight of the Year and Upset of the Year by the Ring magazine. So, you know, who knows? There is one little story as well, was Bob Arum. He actually came out, rival promoter Don King, our favourite Don King. He was a spectator at the bout, and he actually got into a shoving match with Bob Arum because Bob Arum prevented him from entering the ring. And then afterwards he sort of said, that man has nothing to do with this fight. There's no way he belonged in that ring. That just shows you, know, people talk about promoters today, them two hated each other. So, you know, it's a great fight. And it, apart from, as you say, what Jojo Guerrero was thinking, no idea, mate. There's no way that was a 1-1-18, 1-1-10. I don't know what the hell he was watching.
No, again, when you hear people question fighters about what they would change in boxing, even today, they'll say judging in fights, bad judging in fights. And it was there in that fight. It's been in so many fights that have preceded it. Yes, it wasn't a great scorecard. Yes, it kind of hampered the fight just a little bit. It left a taste in people's mouths, because it left the interpretation that the fight was very, very close, because it was called a split decision. Now, if that card would have been more realistic and would have gone to the person that judge felt had won, so they give that to Leonard at 118, 110. If they would have given it to Leonard at 115, 113, then the likelihood is it would have been probably accepted more, but it would have been more cause for a rematch because of how close the cards were. So this just made it even more controversial, the fact that one judge, who they weren't happy with in the first place, they weren't happy with, you know, this particular judge at all. So it was ridiculous, really. I mean, what they did afterwards, they basically got the commission. They had a British judge originally, who was Harry Gibbs, who was supposed to be the original judge instead of Jojo Guerrero. But what Hagler and his camp had said is they didn't want him as the judge, because they favour boxers in a different style. They favour, you know, like we say we interpret fights in a certain way. They basically thought Harry Gibbs, the English judge, was going to interpret the fight in a way that was gonna favour Ray Leonard. And the irony of the whole story was that Gibbs had actually watched the fight at home and scored it himself, and actually give the fight to Hagler.
Yeah.
So it's just crazy. Like, it's an ironic story that the judge that they didn't want, who was replaced, was the guy who, if would have been the judge, would have scored it to Hagler. So this would have been a Hagler win, essentially. Do you know, it's crazy to think that. So we ended up getting the Mexican judge, who was the one that said nope, it was an 8-round to 4-round win for Sugar Ray Leonard. So it's quite crazy to think about. You know, we get this all the time with judging and bad judging, and obviously that was the case.
Marvin, I know you're incredibly disappointed. What's your feeling about the decision?
I beat him, and he knows it, and everybody knows. I knew it was too close. I told you about Vegas. No way about it, you know.
Marvin, he also said that you had K&O in your right hands. You hoped it wouldn't go this far.
Well, you know, I figured I was beating him good, you know. Oh, geez.
Now, how about the first 2 rounds? Gil and I thought that you really gave away the first couple of rounds by boxing in the orthodox style.
I stayed aggressive. I took everything he had. I made him fight. Come on, I won the fight.
Well, I know you're tremendously disappointed, but it was a tremendous show, Marvin. This was more than anybody ever expected in terms of a great championship fight.
They stole it, you know.
Will you come back? Will there be more for you, Marvin?
The way I feel.
Will you consider another fight with this one being so close?
Not with that. No, I don't think with that. I have to talk about it. I have to think about it.
Ray, you told everybody you could do this. Most of us thought it was impossible, said it couldn't happen. You were absolutely convinced, weren't you?
Well, Tim, I am a nonconformist. I made a comeback. It was the defiance of history. They said I couldn't do it. They didn't want me to do it. But you know, Tim, this is the greatest accomplishment in my life. Thank you.
Well, there's no question that it's the greatest accomplishment of any boxer's life, Ray. Here's your mama. You were expected to maybe put on a great show and maybe go a few longer rounds than a lot of people thought. Did you really feel that the course of the fight would go the way it did?
Tim, everybody thought. I'm sure you felt the same way.
I did.
It was an impossible task. Well, like I said, this is the first time a young guy came up against an old guy and a comeback. I prepared myself for 1 year. Tim, I don't know too much more to say. I need to go home and rest.
I know you're going to sleep well tonight. You'll be a little sore, but it's been all worth it?
It was all worth it, Tim. And I miss working with you. We really do. You and Gil.
Well, are you coming back, or are you going to stay in here now?
Depends on the contract.
But obviously this fight, they wanted a rematch. A rematch was on the cards. It was talked about a lot. You know, this was something that it left a bad taste in the mouth of Marvin Hagler. And I know we alluded to earlier on in the episode about, you know, this potentially could have been in Hagler's mind, you know, the end of his career, was coming to the end of his career, and, you know, it was a big payday for him all and stuff. But at the end of the day, you know, he didn't want to go, he obviously didn't want to go out losing. He probably thought this super fight was going to be the icing on the cake for him, you know, winning against a name like Sugar Ray Leonard and then retiring. But because of the loss, it sent a totally different feeling to Marvin Hagler, because there was loads of reports that came out after the fight that he was actually involved in widespread abuse of both alcohol and cocaine, and that he started to go on a sort of downward spiral from there on outwards after this particular fight. But Hagler come out afterwards, months down the line, and actually said no, you know, this never happened, these reports were false. But I can't believe that actually happened, to be honest with you. I mean, we've seen it. There's a lot more openness to that now with the likes of Tyson Fury, you know, coming out of a depressive state to do what he's done, and the way he was open about the fact that he put all the weight on and he was taking drugs and drinking, and that back then was totally different. The society was totally different. So if he was doing that, it would have probably been done behind closed doors. But I can't believe it. I can't believe that could have happened, because this was a bad loss to take for him, really. It was a difficult loss to take for him. Probably the worst one of his career, and I think he's even said it was the worst one, because you got to think about the fact he had lost fights before. He wasn't unbeaten. He didn't lose an unbeaten record in this fight. He'd been unbeaten for 11 years, but he'd lost fights before. But this was a really difficult loss to take for him.
He really didn't take it very well. I think Leonard sort of contemplated, well, he tried to push for a rematch, and it was Hagler that sort of said, do you know what, no, I'm not interested. He said at one time I would have tapped his hands off, but no. And he still to this day believes he won the fight. I think he won the fight. It's difficult. I mean, you mentioned the judges' situation. I mean, how funny is that, you know, just that one decision from Hagler's team has actually impacted on Hagler's career, because if Hagler had won that fight, then what would we be talking about? Would Leonard be as great as people were suggesting? It's interesting. But there is one. I mean, Hugh McIlvenney. I don't know if for people that don't know, he actually passed away this year. But Hugh McIlvenney was a great writer, and he actually headlined this fight as "The Illusion of Victory." He said, like, another view of Leonard Hagler decision. For him, he pointed towards the fact that Jojo Guerrera and Lou Filippo's conflicting scorecards basically stating that bad decisions have no boundary. So basically says the simple truth is that at this stage of its long and erratic history, prize fighting is still nowhere near establishing any consistently accurate means of measuring performance. If the comparative effectiveness of two fighters is so difficult to collaborate or so open to subjective interpretations, then Guerrera and Filippo can contradict each other as outrageously as they did. Then even when everybody stays honest, boxing clearly carries a far higher risk of recruiting injustice than any other sport. Basically, he's just saying that, when the judges talk about focusing on the paramount criteria on identifying effectiveness, aggressiveness, clean punching, ring generalship, and quality defence, they're merely emphasising the complexity, perhaps the impossibility of the exercise. And I think he's bang on. I mean, he's put this out in such a great way that it is true. I mean, that is boxing as a whole. I mean, it is so erratic. Someone can be, that they 1 minute you could, as you say, we go one way, then someone goes the other way. But to score a fight has, as badly as sort of Jojo Guerrera did, it's difficult. He's trying to be honest. He's being honest, but yet it's hard for us to be clear in terms of who's won the fight. At times it's a little bit lopsided. Other times it's pretty clear. But yeah, I think that's spot on in terms of what Hugh McIlvenney said. He also went on to, I'm going to go on too much about it because I'm not going to go word for word because it is quite a long article, but he basically saying, with Leonard, he describes Leonard as looking and moving so much better than anyone had a right to expect. Leonard was in a position to exploit the Schulberg factor. This phenomenon, a compound optical illusion, may not have been discovered by Bud Schulberg, the novelist and fight aficionado, but he receives credit here for pointing out to a few of us who were asking ourselves how Hagler came to be so cruelly misjudged. Bud's reasoning was that people were so amazed to find Sugar Ray capable of much more than they imagined that he persuaded themselves he was doing far more than he actually was. So he's basically saying that it was like an optical illusion. I think it's just a great way of describing the fight, because I scored it in Hagler's favour, that he could use those last flurries to fool everybody, to actually think that he's won the round. I mean, this is just my opinion. I know obviously you see it differently, Sean, but I think in terms of what he's saying, he's pretty spot on. It is an optical... it's an illusion in terms of how we score things in general, in judges, and he used that. And he said the only other person that did was Muhammad Ali, because like you've mentioned, he would steal rounds at the end. And there's only two fighters who've ever done that, and that's Sugar Ray Leonard and Muhammad Ali. And how great are they?
Exactly, and I agree with the whole optical illusion of fights. It is definitely something that happens a lot, and it's always happened. And there's only certain people that can pull it off, and obviously them two names that you mentioned are two people that pulled it off to a T. And it's definitely not gonna sway my decision on what I think about the fight. Don't get me wrong, I still feel watching it back again, watching it with a more objective view, with a more educated view, I still feel like Leonard won the fight. And maybe it was the optical illusion of throwing them flurries in and making it look like he was doing more than what he did. And I mean that's obviously the beauty of Sugar Ray Leonard and what he was able to do. But for other people it was like, no, he didn't really do as much as what you said. He didn't land as many of the punches, or the punches landed on more gloves and elbows than they did actually connecting. And I can understand why people's justifications are behind that. But then people, you could argue he was aggressive, he was this, he was that. You could go and talk about this subject until the cows come home. It's so subjective about what people think about it. And you look at some of the media scorecards from the particular fight, it was very mixed. You had a lot of people giving it a draw. You had a few people giving it to Leonard, a few people giving it to Hagler. So it was a very mixed bag of tricks, really. And some of the rounds, some of the scorecards were like 117, 112, and then you'd have ones as close as 115, 114. So everybody interpreted that totally different in the fight. Everybody who watched that fight had interpreted it in a certain way. You've interpreted it in the way where you felt Hagler had done enough. I'd interpret it in the way where I felt Ray Leonard had done enough. Some people watch it and think that was a draw. So it's the fight that creates the debate, and it'll be a debatable fight for a very long time to come. But it also won a couple of accolades, this particular fight. It was actually named Fight of the Year and Upset of the Year by the Ring magazine, and then later on down the line it was actually named the Upset of the Decade. So it was that well regarded as a fight in general throughout the 80s, because it was, like I said at the start of the episode, it's a super fight. It was billed as a super fight. A lot of people didn't think Ray Leonard would come in there and kind of hang it and do what he did in the fight, and he did, and he managed to win the fight on the scorecard. So quite rightly, it was nominated and won Upset of the Decade. And it's a fight that wouldn't be in the Legendary Nights series, and it wouldn't be something that we would be talking about if there wasn't subjectiveness and controversy around it. And that's the beauty of this particular fight. It was fantastic. There was two parts to the fight. There was the part where Ray Leonard looked like the sublime boxer that he was, and then you had the second part where you felt like it was the boxer puncher in Marvin Hagler, and it was something great to watch. I mean, I can't find probably the correct words and the right words to give it justification and do it justice, but for me it was one of them great fights. It was great for a different reason, not because it was all action all the way through the fight. It was because there was different styles in the fight. There was different technical aspects of the fight, and then there was all the controversy at the end and the stuff that we've spoke about on the episode. So for that reason, for me, it's been a really enjoyable episode to cover and a really enjoyable fight to cover, because there's been so much more intricate detail to talk about in this fight than there has been in some of the others. Because you think about what we've covered off, and some of the others are just a case of they've been fighting in a phone box, or it's been very one-sided, or there's been a spectacular knockout or comeback. This was so technical, this fight. There was so many different sort of stages to it, and so many intricate details in the build-up and the aftermath, that it's what makes it such an overall legendary night for me.
Oh, absolutely. It was just brilliant, legendary night. A great fight to cover, and as you say, not only was the fight a great watch, it was basically the end of the Four Kings for me, as I say. I mean, obviously Leonard went on to fight Holmes for the second time, but that wasn't at their peak. You're talking about, for me, Hagler was I'll always probably just tip Monzon, but then there's more coverage of Hagler. So, you're looking at stuff that you're reading, really, not as much with Monzon, but you're talking that, he's up there with one of the best middleweights in the world. You can go through it. I mean, Duran was one of the best lightweights, and Leonard was probably the best welterweight at the time. And for me, the light middleweight was Hearns's. So, these four guys were exceptional. And, the Hagler and Leonard fight was almost like the fight to suggest who was the best of the four, if you like. It is a tough to call. I mean, I think they're all great in their respective divisions, and they all fought each other at some point. But what a fight to cover. It really was. And there's so, as you say, there's all these little bits of detail that we've tried to squeeze in as much as we can, without trying to waffle on too much. But these are great. Just, you're talking about two fantastic fighters that put on a fantastic show, and it's up for debate. With my advice is, any of the listeners out there, go and watch the fight, make your own opinion. You probably come up with something completely different. I doubt you'll have a Jojo Duran card, but you will probably have something like me and Sean's, where we go either way. But and the other thing I'd say is, if you ain't got the Four Kings DVD, go and pick it up and come watch all their fights. There's a book out as well, by George Kimball, and then you've got The Sorcerer at Caesars by Steve Morantz, which discusses, like the big con, bit like what Hugh McAvenny mentioned, the illusion. mentioned it as a big con in terms of how he conned Hagler. So, you know, there's a couple of books out there. There's so much information out there you can look at and read about and watch, and there's stuff on YouTube. It's just everything about the whole package, you know, just everything. With Leonard, I think this shot him to superstardom for me. This fight in particular made Sugar Ray Leonard what he is. The one thing I did notice as well, which I haven't said, was Ray Charles Leonard was his name. So he's named after Ray Charles. Ray Charles actually sang the national anthem before he came out to the brawl in Montreal. I think that was right. It was either that or the second one. And Ray Charles wasn't even named Ray Charles. Ray Charles actually called Ray Robinson. So in actual fact, you've got a Sugar Ray Robinson, a link between two of them. I just found that really interesting. It's just a point I thought I'd just throw out there. But great fight and great to talk about.
Tonight was a special accomplishment for me. And I respect everyone's opinion and personal viewpoints of the fight. But this fight meant the world to me. I'd like to extend a congratulations to Marvelous Marvin Hagler for giving me the opportunity to make history. Thank you, God bless you.
Yeah, 100%. And for all the listeners out there, I'm sure you'll have enjoyed listening back to this one. If you've not already seen the fight and it's the first time you've heard about the fight broken down in this way, then please go and watch it. Please go and watch it and come back and tell us what you think of the fight, of the build-up, of the details we've talked about in the build-up, of the scorecards at the end, how you scored the fight. I'd be really interested to hear different people's opinions on this subject, because it's been debated now. Look, I mean, we're in what, 2019, so it's over 32 years since this fight took place, and we're still sat here talking about it, and we're still sat here having different opinions about how the fight went down and who won the fight. And that's what it's left for me, a lasting legacy of a great fight, controversy, and the end of the best part of what the Four Kings were. You know, obviously, as you said, Ray Leonard and Hearns in the aftermath would go on to fight later on down the line in '89, but for me this was where everybody I would say was at the pinnacles of the career. Although obviously Ray Leonard was coming back after a layoff, of course, but you know, I don't think he was ever the same after this particular fight. I think after that it was a case of, yeah, he still went on to do some decent things in the sport. I'm not going to deny that fact, but I feel this is where they were all at the very, very best. And this was the last time we'd ever seen Marvin Hagler in a boxing ring. He retired and he was adamant he was never going to come back to a boxing ring, and my word did he stick to it. That is a man with integrity, and that's a man with pride. For him to be able to stay out of the ring, he was only 32 when he made the decision to retire as well, so he could have probably gone on for maybe another 2 years maybe, and still been involved in some of the other great fights that were potentially down the line for him. But he decided, you know, he didn't want to come back because he felt jobbed and he felt robbed in that particular fight, and he was adamant he weren't going to come back, and fair play to him for doing it. And he's led the life he's wanted to lead, so fair play. And for Ray Leonard, obviously, like I say, he went on to have fights with Daniel Lalonde, which was a strange one we spoke about in the past, where there was super middleweight and light heavyweight title on the line at the time. Strange one to go and look back on, but go and do it. And then obviously he had some great fights in there with Tommy Hearns for a third time. So there's lots to look at between both men, and you know, this particular fight will last in the memory of a lot of people. And for new fans, for guys that maybe are only in the very early 20s, maybe late teens, and you've never really had the opportunity to watch this fight, go and watch it, because you're missing out on some great skill and ability and will in a fight. And go and see it and go and tell me what you think about it. Tell us what you think about the fight. Tell us what you think the scorecard should have been, because I'm intrigued to see how many people come back with a Hagler win or a Leonard win or a draw. I'd love to tally it up. So if you've listened to this episode, please go and do that. Please go and watch the fight and tell us who won the fight in your opinion. And I'd like to tot it up and see how many people actually scored it to either fighter, because it'd be very interesting, even now 32 years later, what people actually think about the fight and how they interpret the fight. And it'll be really good to discuss at a later date. But that's it then, that is the episode. So thank you so much for everybody that listens to the podcast. Thank you so much for covering of all the ratings and reviews and all the likes and shares and everything you do for us on social media, the messages we get. We really, really appreciate it. And I want to give a big shout out to Emma B as well. Emma B, our first patron. So thank you so much for that, Emma. You know, we really appreciate it. And if anybody's not already seen the Patreon program, go and check it out. You know, we're trying to push ourselves onto this next level, and this is an opportunity for you guys to be more involved in the podcast, to commission an episode, just to even get a shout out on the podcast or get your name in the credits of an episode. There's things on there that can give you that opportunity to do that for a very small fee to commit to. It really helps us go to that next level. So if you've not already seen the Patreon, go and have a check out of it. It's there. You can find it on BTR Boxing Podcast Facebook page, and you can find it on the Twitter account. Go and find it on there. Subscribe to us if you've not already subscribed to us, and leave us a rating and leave us a review, because they really help us go up the rankings, in particular with iTunes and Apple Podcasts. But if you're a Podbean user or you use any other podcasting app, even if you go and put a little rating in there, anybody that also uses that same app looking for boxing podcasts will see that this is a rated boxing podcast, and are more likely to come and listen to it and actually see some of the quality work that comes out of it. So sorry for rabbiting on, but thank you so much for listening as always. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes. This is one of the most unusual calls